Martin, Alex, and I are delighted to be presenting to you today, and we wish to thank HHN and HHN Explore Research for this opportunity. So our presentation will introduce Canada's, one of Canada's recently published national standards entitled Ethical Review and Oversight of Human Research. We'll focus our presentation on what a national standard of Canada is, for those of you who don't know, why national standards are important for human research and its ethical oversight, the differences between policies, standards, and procedures, how national standards are developed, who this particular national standard of Canada was designed for, some highlights of the national standard, the benefits of adopting it, and where, of course, you can obtain your free copy of it. So next slide, please. I'd like to begin by outlining who develops national standards of Canada. The Standards Council of Canada, a Crown corporation, accredits standards development organizations, or SDOs, to develop standards that meet the needs of industry, government, and consumers. SCC accredited SDOs are responsible for the development, publication, and maintenance of Canadian national standards. Currently, 12 SDOs have been accredited since SCC began its operations approximately 50 years ago. You may recognize some of them, like one you may be familiar with is HSO, or Health Standards Organization, and that's the SDO that develops national standards for healthcare. Among these 12 SDOs that you see at the bottom of the slide is the SDO that we represent, HRSO, or Human Research Standards Organization. All of these SDOs are not-for-profit Canadian organizations, and many, like HRSO, do not charge users for the standards that they develop. HRSO develops national standards of relevance to Canadians conducting, overseeing, and participating in human research. Its sister company is a conformity assessment organization called Human Research Accreditation Canada, HRA Canada, and some of you in this room are accredited by HRA Canada. The national standards that HRSO develops form the basis for the accreditation program of HRA Canada. So this brings us to the first poll question. If you can bring that up, thank you. So the question is, or the statement is, Canada's national standards for human research are mandatory. So is that true or false? It's false. National standards of Canada are not mandatory in any industry or sector of each industry. They're voluntary and they're market driven. However, there's a however. National standards of Canada become mandatory when they're enforced by laws or regulations, and these are normally done because of health or safety reasons. So it's false. We ask people to voluntarily adhere to the national standards of Canada in every industry in Canada, and only when they're embraced by laws or regulations are they mandatory. So thank you for participating in that poll. Okay, so the next slide, please. So why do we need national standards for human research? Generally speaking, national standards frame, guide, and normalize almost every aspect of our lives. In Canada, we have national standards pertaining to healthcare, information technology, agriculture, plumbing, electricity, and the list goes on. These national standards promote best industry practices, emphasizing safety and quality, and ensure the interoperability of those practices. National standards eliminate the variability in interpreting regulations, guidelines, and policies. And for human research, they provide stakeholders with clear, concise requirements upon which they can develop their procedures. National standards promote uniform conduct of human research, creating a research environment that is harmonized and collaborative. Next slide, please. So what's the difference between a policy, a standard, and a procedure? These terms are often used interchangeably, and this has led to numerous misunderstandings of what governs human research in our country. First of all, a policy tells us what is important and answers the question, why do I need to do this? It doesn't tell us what's required in order to do it, or even how to do it. A standard, on the other hand, it assigns quantifiable measures to something like a policy or a regulation or a guideline, and answers the question, what is required in order to meet it? A procedure establishes the proper steps to take and answers the question, how do I do this? I know that you're very familiar with procedures and how important they are to maintaining operations, but without standards, we've all been basing our procedures for human research on our individual interpretations of policies and other regulatory and guidance documents, making it virtually impossible to harmonize our practices and promote collaborations in our country. Next slide, please. An example of the differences between a policy, a standard, and a procedure and their interplay comes from the policy that governs human research in our country, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, Ethical Conduct for Research Involving Humans, or the TCPS2. The TCPS2 states that consent shall be given voluntarily. And I imagine that researchers in the room and across the country have procedures for obtaining voluntary informed consent from research participants, but that no two procedures are the same because the level of adherence to that policy, excuse me, is left up to our individual interpretations of what is required in order to meet it. In our recently published National Standard of Canada, the one that we're going to talk about today, the HRSO Technical Committee developed requirements for the Tri-Council Policy Statement and other regulatory documents, including this requirement, so that Canadian researchers can understand what is required in order to meet it when they write their procedures. 2 slides, please. That one, and then one more. Okay, so how does an SCC accredited SDO like HRSO develop national standards of Canada? The first step in the process is the development of a proposal. A proposal is a document that describes the project need of the national standard or why a national standard is needed. And this project need usually comes from stakeholders. For HRSO, the project need can come from REB members, researchers, research administrators, Health Canada, other SDOs, or even research participants, among others. The proposal is transformed into a notice of intent, which is then submitted to the Standards Council of Canada for publication. The draft national standard is developed from the proposal according to SCC accredited procedures, including even the specific way in which requirements are written and expressed. National standards are developed from current policies, regulations, and guidelines, as I mentioned, or what are referred to as normative documents or references. And recall from the previous slide that these documents tell us why we need to do something. And the standard, the national standard that's developed, tells us what is required in order to do it. And that is why national standards are expressed through requirements that are easy to understand, unambiguous, complete, and accurate. A specific technical committee is established to develop the National Standard of Canada. Because published national standards must meet the interests of all stakeholders, it's very important that technical committee members represent a balance of concerned interest groups and come from all regions of Canada. All decisions made during national standards development use the process of consensus decision-making. In general, consensus decision-making is a process for groups like a technical committee to generate widespread agreement in a way that respects the contributions of all participants. Another way SDOs like HRSO ensure that national standards meet the interests of all stakeholders is to release their draft national standards to the public for a consultation period, for a set amount of time. And in for HRSO, our set amount of time is 60 days. And just an aside, we have a public consultation ongoing right now for our most recent National Standard of Canada entitled Conduct of Human Research. And you'll see our website at the end of the presentation where you can go and participate in that National Standard public consultation. And all of the comments that we receive from the public consultation are addressed by the technical committee, and the draft national standard is revised if necessary to produce the final National Standard of Canada. The SCC, the Standards Council of Canada, undergoes a review of that final document prior to publishing it to ensure that it fulfills all of its accreditation requirements. Published national standards are accessible to the public, in our case, free of charge from our website, and are maintained at regular intervals and revised when there are changes to or when there are new normative documents or references. So that concludes my section of the presentation, and I'll turn it over to my colleague, Alex Karabanow.
Thank you, Janice, for providing an overview of the general development process for National Standards of Canada. And I will now focus my part of the presentation on our experience in the development of this particular National Standard of Canada for the ethical review and oversight of human research as leader for this technical committee. First, I'd like to ask you to do another polling question. If you could bring that up, Bryn. True or false, I can participate in the development of Canada's national standards for human research. The correct answer is true. You can participate in the standards development process in two ways. First, you can express an interest in joining a technical committee by completing a form on the HRSO website, and Janice will give us a link to the website at the end of the presentation. Alternately, you can participate in the public consultation period, which is open to anyone prior to the final publication of the NSC. Next slide, please. As Janice previously indicated, there are systematic procedures that must be followed by a standards development organization in the drafting of National Standards of Canada, including the constitution of a technical committee that is representative of the diversity of our country in terms of both geography and user categories. These committees use a consensus approach to developing national standards, and the process includes a public consultation phase for feedback before publication. There must be a balance of concerned interest groups, combining the efforts of Canadians such as research administrators, researchers, bioethicists, regulators, sponsors, policymakers, insurers, auditors, and research participants in the development of HRSO's national standards. In addition, one of the primary ethical justifications for conducting human research is to benefit society. Therefore, feedback from the public is integral to the development of NSCs. Next slide, please. The technical committee was established by soliciting referrals from the technical steering committee members, the leadership group of HRSO, as well as from the previous technical committee members. Members of the public were also able to indicate an interest in participating on the technical committee by sending a message from the HRSO website. This particular technical committee included individuals like members of the panel on research ethics, bioethicists, REB members, and research administrators from across the country. Over the course of developing the 3 NSCs for human research, we have had 5 members of the panel on research ethics participating on HRSO technical committees, and with its sister organization, HRA Canada, Canada's first independent, not-for-profit, non-governmental conformity assessment body for human research. Information sessions were held in August of 2020 so that prospective technical committee members could learn about the standards development process and also what time commitment would be involved in their participation. After these meetings, prospective members could indicate their interest and willingness to participate. The first technical committee meeting was held on September 21st, 2020, and this is where the members were introduced to each other and a bit of education about the consensus process of decision-making took place. Further, the group learned about the procedures for developing national standards of Canada. Finally, the group determined the frequency and length of meetings for the process. This particular technical committee decided to have weekly meetings of 1.5 hours in duration. The discussions of the technical committee were rich and thoughtful and a learning process in and of itself. The different perspectives of the experts on the committee also highlighted the critical importance and need for national standards of Canada. As you can see by the Gantt chart, the technical committee took approximately 5 months over 21 meetings to develop the draft National Standard of Canada for the ethical review and oversight of human research, after which there was a 60-day public consultation period. This public consultation period was advertised on the HRSO website, as well as through multiple messages disseminated on social media, specifically on LinkedIn and Twitter. The technical committee then reviewed over 100 comments received during the consultation, and it took 3 more meetings to go through them all and make any necessary changes to the proposed draft National Standard of Canada. Once complete, the draft National Standard was submitted to the Standards Council of Canada for review and publication, and it was formally published on June 16, 2021. Next slide, please. Now, who does this National Standard of Canada apply to? This NSC applies to all individuals, as well as for-profit and not-for-profit, public and private organizations engaged in the ethical review and oversight of human research, such as those involved in establishing, administering, and ensuring effective REB operations, and also regulatory authorities and other organizations that evaluate REBs. Next slide, please. Canada has a fragmented regulatory approach to research involving humans. There are federal guidelines for institutions receiving federal funds issued by the Interagency Advisory Panel on Research Ethics, and federal guidelines on research integrity and conflict of interest issued by the Interagency Advisory Panel on the Responsible Conduct of Research. Canada has federal regulations for human research involving investigational drugs, medical devices, and natural health products issued by Health Canada. Canada also has varying federal and provincial regulations relating to privacy of personal health information. In addition, there are federal regulations for radiation safety, transportation of dangerous goods, the use of controlled goods, and biosafety, just to name a few. This complex regulatory environment makes it difficult for research institutions to adequately oversee the conduct of research involving humans that may involve some or all of these regulations and guidelines. As a policy, the Tri-Council Policy Statement, or TCPS, is a joint policy of Canada's 3 federal research agencies: the Canadian Institutes of Health Research, the Natural Sciences and Engineering Research Council of Canada, and the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council of Canada. It was developed to serve as a mechanism to control those institutions receiving federal funding from these 3 federal granting councils, and only extends to these organizations. The TCPS informs and provides guidance to Canadian researchers on what is important and why regarding the ethical conduct of research involving humans. Currently, REBs use the guidance of the TCPS in their determination of the ethical feasibility of human research. And as Janice mentioned, the TCPS does not apply to all REBs in Canada. And because the TCPS is a policy, its interpretation varies from one organization to another and from one province to another, creating barriers to harmonization, collaboration, and growth of the research enterprise within Canada and internationally. Similarly, Canada's Food and Drugs Act and applicable regulations incorporate an internationally accepted good clinical practice guideline that stipulates that interventional or clinical research on humans cannot be initiated without the review and approval by a properly constituted REB. This is the International Council for Harmonization Good Clinical Practice Guideline, or ICH-GCP, which is an international standard for one type of human research, clinical research. The ICH-GCP guideline has been adopted by Health Canada and provides a basis for the work of the Health Products and Food Branch Inspectorate. However, the regulations only apply to interventional or clinical research and do not include policies or standards pertaining to how REBs determine a favorable outcome. Many organizations conducting other forms of research involving humans are therefore not covered by these regulations. This NSC uses these Canadian normative documents in addition to the US Code of Federal Regulations, as well as others shown on this slide. Of course, standards will apply to all organizations that voluntarily adopt them. Now, Martin Letendre will review some of the innovations and highlights of this new National Standard of Canada.
Thank you very much, Alex. So the answer is false. The national standard adopts a practice-oriented approach by providing a harmonized interpretation of the Canadian normative references, allowing for a pan-Canadian uniformed approach regardless of where the research is being conducted, who funds the research, or what is the research discipline. So Alex referred to the Canadian regulatory environment as being fragmented, with variable applications depending on the funding, location, or nature of research. The Canadian regulatory environment could also be seen as a clump of rules, out of which the technical committee, through its work, acted as a spinning wheel to produce a uniform string of requirements. The NSC proposes a practice-oriented interpretation of the normative documents, providing for its users the tools to develop procedural documents that are logical and easy to implement. The National Standard of Canada also proposes a novel and holistic approach as it embraces all research with humans. It also organized the requirements in a way that follows the natural flow of research. So let's explore some examples over the next slides. As you read the technical requirements on the ethical review and oversight of research, you will notice that they follow the life cycle of human research, starting with the requirements for the initial review of research, leading to the requirements for the oversight of research once REB approval is granted, and ending with the requirements for the review of research at the time of its conclusion. Ethics oversight requirements distinguish between the procedures needed for the ongoing reporting and review of research events and the procedures to be developed for the continuing review of research, often referred to as the annual review, since normative documents require that research be reviewed by the REB at a minimum on an annual basis. Finally, the NSC establishes the requirements for REBs to consider a study closed or for early suspension or termination of ethics approval. Another example of the practice-oriented approach of the National Standard of Canada is its writing structure. Each subsection is preceded by a categorical statement, providing for a bird's eye view of the technical requirements of the NSC. The categorical statement is then followed by a detailed listing of the elements that an organization's procedural documents must contain in order to meet the requirements of the categorical statement. Therefore, an institutional official could have a broad understanding of the technical requirements of the NSC by simply reading the categorical statements, while quality assurance professionals and REB administrators will want to understand the technical requirements specificity. Here, we will look at the technical requirements for the REB's mandate and constitution to illustrate the structure of the NSC. So the REB's mandate and constitution has 4 categorical statements. On this slide, we can read the first 2. Oops. Sorry about that. That the REB shall function in accordance with procedural documents to determine the types of research that is mandated to review and oversee, and the REB shall function in accordance with procedural documents that establish and maintain its composition and ensure that its members have the expertise, independence, and multidisciplinary background essential for a competent ethical review and ongoing evaluation of the research under its auspices. In other circumstances, the National Standard of Canada provides clarification about existing references that for, did I skip a slide? I'm sorry. No, I'm good, sorry. So in other circumstances, the National Standard of Canada provides clarification about existing normative references that for some reasons were subject to a variety of interpretations by Canadian research organizations. This was the case, for example, with reconsiderations and appeals of REB decisions. Through discussions within and outside the HRSO technical committee, it became evident that organizations had their own interpretation of the normative references applicable to REB's duties to hear requests for reconsiderations and for organizations to establish an appeal mechanism of REB decisions. Often, appeals and reconsiderations were thought to be one and the same, when, for instance, the Tri-Council policy statement regards them as being two distinct processes. Other Canadian normative references are silent about the issue, although they require that researchers be informed of the REB's appeal procedures. So the National Standard of Canada offers clarity by confirming the requirement for organizations to have distinct processes to manage requests for reconsiderations and appeals of REB decisions. In some circumstances, the HRSO Technical Committee had to innovate by interpreting the normative documents to fill areas where the normative references were silent without overstepping in creating policy. A good example of this situation is the subsection on concluding review. As previously mentioned, the National Standard of Canada interpreted the technical requirements for ethics review and oversight following the life cycle of the study. In this specific case, the technical committee took a step further than the normative references. The technical committee established a normalization of the interpretation of the normative references based on best practices adopted by some research organizations. The proposed new terminology, concluding review, provides a clearer representation of the reality of research with humans. It also emphasizes that the REB must conduct a review of the research before considering that a study is closed, and that the REB oversight is no longer required. In order for this NSC to embrace all types of research with humans, tremendous efforts were made by the technical committee towards using language that would be neutral. Efforts were also made to avoid transposing normative references specific to one field of research as a one-size-fits-all to all types of research. One example is the development of the concept of negative impacts of research, which is defined as any event, whether anticipated or not, that does or could adversely affect research data integrity, the health, welfare, interests, or rights of research participants, investigators, researchers, and third parties such as families and communities, or the conduct of the research. Examples include, but are not limited to, breaches of privacy, adverse events, serious adverse events, incidental findings, and unanticipated problems. So the concept of negative impacts of research allow organizations to tailor their processes for identifying, monitoring, mitigating, assessing, managing, and reporting negative impacts to the particular types of research under their auspices. I will now invite Alex to discuss the numerous benefits of adopting this NSC.
Thanks, Martin. National standards for human research promote uniform conduct and oversight of human research from one organization to another, one province to another, and internationally. National standards tell us what is required in order to meet current policies and other normative references. By eliminating the variability in interpreting policies and these references, national standards provide researchers with clear, concise requirements upon which they can develop their unique procedures. Until we started our initiative 3 or 4 years ago, no national standards existed in our country for the ethical conduct and oversight of human research, and indeed anywhere else in the world. Consequently, human research was not conducted uniformly, and this often created barriers to harmonization, collaboration, causing unnecessary delays and slowing the growth of this industry sector within Canada and internationally. This is the reason that the development of national standards in human research is so important and will allow research to be conducted in a more consistent manner across the country and will cover all organizations, whether public or private, whether funded or not, and for whatever type of research that is being undertaken without the need for further government intervention or regulation. Next slide, please. The National Standard of Canada for Ethical Review and Oversight of Human Research uses several strategies to help the user fulfill the requirements included in this standard. For example, the NSC has informative annexes which help in the understanding of the requirements by listing some examples and guidance to meet the requirements. These are not meant to be exhaustive or complete list of examples, but rather to allow the user to better understand how the standards can be applied to different contexts and methodologies of human research. The wording of the requirements attempted to remove the variability of interpretation of the regulations, policies, and guidelines that we observed over the past 20 years since the introduction of the TCPS. Indeed, as Martin presented in his review of the highlights of the NSC, some best practices were introduced so that organizations adopting the NSC can exceed the requirements in the normative Canadian policy and regulations. Organizations have the flexibility to customize their procedures to conform to the NSC while removing the need to be dependent on templated SOPs that may not reflect the organization's actual context. Next slide, please. Across the world, public and private organizations conducting and overseeing human research have adopted the Human Research Protection Program, or HRPP, as the most appropriate governance structure for human research protection oversight, and human research accreditation as the currency of human research quality and efficiency. The organizational structures recommended by national standards will be responsible for the way education is designed and delivered to stakeholders, and will be critical to creating and promoting a culture of research safety and quality, and to enhance the practice and oversight of researchers and healthcare professionals in those institutions. The development of national standards will allow for the establishment of a trust framework for the conduct and oversight of research involving humans in Canada. As a leader in the establishment of standards in many sectors, Canada will now benefit from having national standards for human research, which will greatly influence organizations conducting and overseeing human research, a course of action that is optimal for bringing all Canadian research organizations on a level playing field without the need for further regulation or government intervention.